Shalom Aleichem. Welcome. I'm Christa Whitney, Director of the Yiddish Book Center's Wexler Oral History Project, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, or whatever time of day it is where any of you are. Thank you all so much for coming. And just before I get started, a couple of reminders that your video and audio will be off throughout the program. And please do submit any questions you have via the question panel, which is on the lower right of your screen. And if you can try to keep them as questions rather than comments, that would be great. So I can be sure to try to answer them all. Okay, so as I said, I'm Christa Whitney, and I'm flying solo tonight with tech help from Oren. So I thought I'd start with a little bit of introduction about who I am in case there's anyone in the audience that doesn't know me. So I am have been on staff at the Yiddish Book Center for 16 years now. I'm a proud alum of the Yiddish Book Center's programs. I started out learning Yiddish at the Yiddish Book Center's Steiner Summer Yiddish program, and then went through the fellowship program before I became a staff member. And it's my pleasure tonight to talk to you all to highlight some stories from the Yiddish Book Center's Wexler Oral History Project that are about Yiddish theater. So I'm going to get sharing my screen here. Okay, so voices from the Yiddish stage. So being an oral historian means following the plumb line down deep into the memories of individuals. Down there in the realm of memories, history comes in pieces, one story or description at a time. A favorite metaphor of mine from my dear oral history mentor, Dr. Jane Guberman, is that history is a mosaic. The larger story of Yiddish theater, or really any aspect of collective experience, is made up of many, many individual memories. Particularly with this subject, which from my perspective has been a somewhat neglected piece of Jewish history. The vivid images of people and places, disparate opinions, and conflicting accounts complement the dates and names that we know thanks to the work of this field's few dedicated scholars. The contours of this entire world of Yiddish culture, and particularly the world of Yiddish theater in its heyday, is a world that my generation will never be able to experience. And it comes together only in the aggregate of many stories. And furthermore, it's only through understanding this past, or it's important to understand this past to give context to today's Yiddish theater scene. So tonight, I'll attempt to replicate my experience as an oral historian of Yiddish culture and history, which has been learning through the mosaic of individuals' stories. I am not a Yiddish theater scholar. It's not a focus of my particular research, but it's something that is well represented in the Yiddish Book Center's collection, including in our oral history collection. And so I hope that along this journey, you all will learn something new and perhaps even be interested in learning more. And I wanted to, before we get to the stories, just give you a bit of context about the Oral History Project. Since 2010, we at the Yiddish Book Center have been recording in-depth video oral history interviews. We are very near to 1,600 of these interviews. They're recorded in English, Yiddish, and many other languages. We've recorded in over 20 countries around the world. And these interviews together talk about a lot of different aspects of Yiddish language and culture, and a lot of other topics that come up along the way related to people's lives and experiences. And these interviews are publicly accessible on the Yiddish Book Center's website, yiddishbookcenter.org. So all of the videos that I will be showing tonight are short clips from much longer oral histories. So if you're interested in learning more, or if you're interested in seeing more from someone that you meet on the screen tonight, I encourage you to go over to yiddishbookcenter.org and check it out. So Yiddish theater, how to approach this? As I laid out, I'm going to be taking this particular approach of looking at various stories, and I've divided it up to give us a bit of a journey through this world. So, as a historian, it makes sense to start with the start. The theater has a deep history, or performance, I should say, has a deep history in Jewish tradition. Often cited that the Purim Spiel is the origin of Jewish theater. In its Eastern European beginnings, many Yiddish actors came out of the Romanian theater. Traveling troupes began in the mid-19th century. The sometimes credited first Yiddish theater group were the Brodersinger from Brody in Ukraine, and they were Jewish itinerant performers, perform musical and theatrical pieces in spaces such as taverns, wine cellars, and gardens. And then we get to 1876, where Avram Goldfaden founds the first professional Yiddish theater troupe in Romania. So what is Yiddish theater? Well, art draws from life, and Yiddish theater therefore drew from Jewish life in Eastern Europe and in the places where Yiddish-speaking Jews were living. It also draws certainly from Yiddish literature. And here we're going to start with a couple of stories about what exactly are some components of Yiddish theater. So first of all, we'll hear from the actor Annabella, and she was from Chernowitz, and she performed for many years in the Yiddish Spiel Theater in Tel Aviv.
In Umfang haben wir gewohnt in einem großen Haus mit den Sachquartieren, aber als Jiden. Das war ein jüdisch Viertel. Und dort habe ich eingesagt, die Typen, die Schulmalechim-Typen, was ich später gespielt auf der Bühne, weil es ist, Mama ist gewesen Schulmalechim. Also jede Zippebälle-Reise, jede schöne Schenkel, jede Etemenje, alle sind gewesen dort. Ich habe sie so gut gekannt, ich bin aufgewachsen zwischen sie. Der Pfarrer, wenn ich spiele Shalom Aleichem, ist von mir, ich kehre sich ihm zurück heim.
And another perspective from Millie Guberman-Kravitz, who grew up in Boston. Oops. Here. Yes.
I remember Abe's Irish Rose and the pathos of the struggle of this young couple where she was Irish and he was Jewish, and neither family was happy about it. And the audience was, Jewish. All of this was in Yiddish. It was at a time when the thrust for so many was to become Americanized. And, one of the unintended consequences, in a way, had to do with it's not being part of a shtetl, that when you go out into the larger community, you meet people who aren't Jewish, fall in love with someone who isn't Jewish. So there was, all of that.
All right. So, of course, we're already seeing in those two accounts pretty different aspects of Yiddish theater, and it's never been one thing. We can understand Yiddish theater history as a series of streams with join in fruitful partnerships and split away from each other with infamous falling outs, currents mixing with other nations and languages, crossing continents, and reappearing on the other side of oceans. So again, my approach to telling such a complex history is this story by story approach, and hope that by the end we'll get a bit of a glimpse of a broader picture. So the circuit, it just was talking about geography, and certainly there was an interconnected international scene that mirrored the broader scene of Yiddish speakers and Yiddish culture. And like today, there's a range of art within this genre. So we have highbrow, sort of intellectual versions of Yiddish theater and popular manifestations. So you have on the sort of highbrow side, you would have the Vilna troupe, the art theater coming out of oftentimes the Russian theatrical traditions. And then you would also have revues, theater mixed with music and vaudeville, burlesque that might have appealed to broader audiences. So here we'll hear a little bit more about that from someone who may be familiar to some of you, Carrot O'Brien, may be familiar if you follow the Yiddish theater scene in New York or have seen in some of the Yiddish Book Center's programs. Carrot has been researching, translating, and performing Yiddish theater for many years. Early on, she found mentors in two great Yiddish actors, Luba Katazin and Simo Rechtzeit. And so here she's going to give us a brief, broad intro to Yiddish theater in the 20th century.
Well, the Yiddish theater was a very vast theatrical movement that was united by performing in Yiddish. There was the literary theater that was non-musical theater. There was musical theater. There was also marionette theater. There was also Yiddish acting schools. There was also political theater and anarchist theater and just biblical dramas. The Yiddish theater was truly an international theater, and Yiddish actors were often more sophisticated than, American actors who had grown up just in the American theater. And in fact, the vast majority of Yiddish actors were not born in America, so they had more of a sense of what was happening all over the world. So they started in Bucharest, and they would travel around Eastern Europe because you want to keep the one play going and make as much money as you can. Lubit remembers going and performing in small towns where people didn't have money and would bring a chicken to the box office, or being carried over mud because they were performing in places that had no entertainment or even had no roads, and they would go wherever the people were. And then they were brought to America by Maurice Schwartz, and then the Buenos Aires season was the opposite of the American season. So during the American summer, when the Yiddish theater wouldn't have main stage shows, it would just, people would go to the Catskills or they would do cabaret type shows. They would get a contract to go to Buenos Aires and perform there. People would hear about a star or they'd hear about a play and they'd want to see it. Well,
So within that international network, we have dozens, hundreds of different places, different stages, different theaters, different scenes where Yiddish theater is being performed. In the first decades of the 20th century, Yiddish theater is flourishing in Europe, but there are also centers in the America. As we heard from Kared, we had Buenos Aires was a big hub, and also Australia, Africa. There's Yiddish theater represented across the globe. So now we're going to hear a couple of stories about the places themselves, about the theaters. So we're going to hear two examples first from 1930s Eastern Europe. So first we'll hear from Shura Greenhuis-Turkov. If you are aware of Yiddish theater history, that name Turkov might ring a bell. She herself, Shura, was from a theater family, and she met her second husband from the famous Turkov family of Yiddish cultural activists while acting with him on stage. They performed Yiddish theater in Poland and then in Israel.
Es ist gewesen in Bialystok ein größer Theater, was hat schon vor der Milchome gehört zum jüdischen Theater. Es waren etwas zwei Balabate jüdische, was haben aufgebaut im Theater und dort haben gespielt die ganze Zeit. Doch vor der Milchome sind gekommen Aktionen von Gastrolieren, von Warschau, von Ausland, von Amerika. Und es ist ständig gewesen ein jüdischer Theater in Bialystok. Mit der Sache, Aktionen, die kommen von Warschau und von ganz Polen. Ein guter jüdischer Theater, mit einer guten jüdischen Sprache. Und ich bin ständig gewesen unter die Kulissen von Theater, auf alle Vorstellungen, alle haben wir gekannt. Schurke hat man mir gerufen. Ja.
Theater hat gearbeitet die ganze Zeit unten in Keller.
I just want to introduce Jakob Basner before we hear from him. So he is from Riga, Latvia, and he survived the Holocaust and immigrated to California later in life. And there he became a beloved Yiddish teacher. And so we're going to hear from him about pre-war theater in Riga.
Theater hat gearbeitet die ganze Zeit unten in Keller Gewände, wo sie tun sich über die Garderobe mit den Grimm. Und eben gewinnt der Theater. Der Theater wird sein, meistens einfach spielen, meistens in die so Wochen. Und es wird seiner Sache größere Element kommen in Theater. Alles, was sie gewinnen, das gewinnen in jüdischen Club, der jüdische Club. Also das wird sein noch in dem Tag wird sein der Theater. Dort man kontrollieren die Billetten, bei einer Rufgang dort gestanden. Wir fangen allemaal haben, wenn wir rufen Kontermacht. Das ist das einfach frei, unsere Kinder. Und wir gewinnen der Saal. Und dort fangen sie spielen. Und dann gewinnen das Souffleur. Einmal gewinnen vorgekommen nach einer interessanten Sache dort mit dem Souffleur. Hat untergesagt, die Artistke, sie ist wenn die Artistke ist reingetan ins Spiel und sie redet alles Ding, wenn sie vergisst, aber das Mal oder was, redet sie noch, was sagt. Und hat gesagt, nicht kein schönes Wort. Und sie hat es herausgeredet. Und später mit dem Geld ablassen von der Arbeit, sie gehen ganz so dort in Tummel. Ja, hat gemacht auch Hochmann. Und er gesagt, ja, aber sie hat gedacht, du wirst nicht sagen, zu wem hat er gesagt. Und sie hat doch gesagt, das. Sie gehen unten dort, aber vielleicht man kann trinken dort, wenn es sie gewinnt darüber ist. Aber wir hat man nicht gegessen, nein. Menschen fangen sich an zu kommen in Theater, fangen sich an, ausputzen sich. Ja. Ich bin beliebt, das Theater in Riga. Theater hat gearbeitet.
And we're going to hear a couple more stories from different contexts. So next we will hear from Herman Rothenberg, who works in the diamond business, where he still gets to use his Yiddish sometimes. And here he shares his memories of attending Yiddish theater in the 50s and 60s in New York.
So for enjoyment, we would go to the Yiddish theater, the Second Avenue Theater. I think on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis. It was a lot of fun. We saw movies. It was broken down. You saw, I forgot which way it went, but you saw a Yiddish film. I mean, a real old-time Yiddish film. And then there was a break, And then there were these vendors who sold ice cream and I don't know what they sold, you know, whatever they sold. It was all in Yiddish, you know. Ice cream, wer will that ice cream? Wie viel kostet das? Atula, you know. Because everyone spoke Yiddish and the kids spoke Yiddish. It was like just you sitting here is like just commonplace, you know. This is the way it was.
I wanted to take us somewhere a little bit less expected, perhaps, over to Melbourne, Australia. So here we have Hyla Jacobs talking about who she herself is from Kalisz, Poland, from a Yiddishist family. Her mother was a Yiddish educator and her father was a Yiddish actor. Her parents were both survived the Holocaust and then immigrated to Australia, where her father almost immediately got involved in Yiddish theater, and as did her mother in the Yiddish schools. And Hyla herself very quickly got involved in performing Yiddish theater too.
Gewesen ein interessanter Ort, wo Menschen kommen, vom Vater Milchome Jahren früher, sind gelaufen von den Pogromen in Polen und in Russland, sind sie gelaufen über der Welt. Nicht alle können kommen in Amerika, aber sind gekommen in Australien. Und Australier haben sich eingeordnet und gemacht Fabriken und geworden ganz vermöglich. Also als Polen fängt schicken, Menschen sind gekommen, verschiedene Menschen sammeln Geld da. Und zwischen sie ist gekommen Janke Weißlitz, wenn man mit rausgeschickt von Polen, zu sammeln Geld in Europa und Australien für Yiddish Theater in Polen. Und ist verfahren in Australien und der Mohammed ist ungeheuben Sache und geblieben stecken da. Dieselbe Sache gewesen mit Rochel Holzer, dieselbe Sache gewesen mit der Sache jüdische Schreiber. Wir sind gefahren zufällig und geblieben stecken in Australien, weil der Mohammed sich ungeheuben. Ist Australien, speziell Melbourne, gewesen maseldick. Also in der so verworfenen Winkel wie in Australien, haben wir gehabt solche wunderbare Akteure wie Rochelholzer und Weißlitz. Das sind gewesen bekannt und bewusst in Polen für den Mohammed.
So now I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about some of the Yiddish celebrities, some of the stars of the Yiddish stage. We've already heard some name dropping. We just heard in the last clip a couple of names that may or may not be familiar to any of you who are fans of Yiddish theater history. And I'd like to just highlight a couple of the names, the big personalities in the Yiddish theater history. So we will start with Ludwig Zatz. He lived from 1891 to 1944, best known for his comic roles. In fact, in 1925, the New York Times called him the greatest Yiddish comic actor of all time. He appeared in Yiddish films, and he actually started out as a child actor in Europe, in Lemberg, and he worked in multiple theater troupes across Eastern Europe. And he was involved in the founding of the Yiddish Art Theater in 1919. He worked with the Tomaszewskis, he worked in Philadelphia with Ansel Shore, at the Second Avenue Theater, other theaters, and he wrote lyrics and music for several productions, sometimes anonymously. And he also is connected to the Adler family, if you're familiar with Celia Adler or Stella Adler, another famous Yiddish theater family. He's a brother-in-law of Celia Adler. And here we're going to hear from someone who also may be familiar to some of you, Fivish Finkel, who himself started out on the Yiddish stage and eventually won an Emmy on the TV show Picket Fences in English. And here he is remembering Ludwig Zatz, who he considered a mentor.
Es gewesen Ludwig Zatz. Das ist gewesen ein Akteur. Das ist gewesen ein Komiker. Das ist gewesen ein tragischer Akteur. Ist gewesen, wie man sagt, mein Mentor. Ludwig Zatz. Ich habe nur gewollt sein an Ludwig Zatz. Der hat gehabt als Sachrollen, was hat gespielt mit Schmink. Man hat geriefen Make-up-Schmink damals. Gemacht seine Bärlach und alles. Ist gewesen komisch, hat gekonnt, dramatische Szene hat gekonnt spielen. Ein größer Akteur.
Next up, we're going to hear about a duo, Jigan and Schumacher. Shimon Jigan, who lived from 1905 to 1980, and Israel Schumacher, who lived from 1908 to 1961. They first met at the Jewish Theater in Lodz, Poland, the revolutionary Jewish theater, and they went on to make many films and stage shows, LP, audio recordings, and they founded a cabaret company. They worked in Israel, and their works were made into a Yiddish language television program in the 70s. So they really had a long and wide careers together and then eventually separately. And here we're going to hear from Leah Schlanger, who herself was already an established actor in post-war Poland before making Aliyah. And after coming to Tel Aviv, she performed with several Yiddish stars, including Jigan and Schumacher.
Wieso haben wir es gesehen? Jigan hat uns gesehen im Leben, hat uns gesehen wie ein super intelligenter Mann. Wie wollte gesagt, wie einer, was geht aus vom Büro und getan, ständig gehabt, sehr guten Tag zu gehen und getan. Ist gewesen da. Ich kann nicht sagen, sehr hoch, aber nicht niedrig. Schumacher ist gewesen ein bisschen niedriger von ihm und gehabt eine Lissine, schon. Und es ist gewesen sehr interessant, ist ständig gegangen mit einer Bärstelle und sich gekämmt. Die zwei herrlich, was hat gehabt. Mir pflegen, ich sage mir, weil ich mit noch einer Aktrice vom Hebräischen Theater und wir pflegen sitzen ständig Schabes im Kaffeehaus, leben uns dort, weil ich wohne, leben dem Kikar Rabin, dem Platz, Rabinplatz. Und Jigan hat gewohnt nicht weit von dort. Und wir pflegen ständig sitzen dort zusammen, Schabussim, und reden und schmusen. Und Jigan pflegt, erzählen Witzen und so weiter. Und im Leben ist nicht gewöhnt, kein, zu sagen, sehr freilicher Mensch. Also wie man sagt, wegen Komiker. Sie sind nicht freilich, sie sind unmütig. Aber es ist gewöhnt sehr ein lieber Mensch. Und sie gewinnen eine große Schuld, wenn sie sich zerschägt.
Next, we'll hear about Molly Picon. She lived from 1898 to 1992, and she started out in the Yiddish theater at age 6, eventually becoming successful also in English language theater. She was born in New York City to Polish-born immigrants, and her most famous film, Yiddle Mitten Fiddle from 1936. At one point there was the Molly Picon Theater, opened in 1931. And in 1940, she had her English language stage debut. 1981, she was inducted into the American Theater Hall of Fame. And here we're going to see hear from someone who himself is also connected. This is sort of a theme that the people speaking are also themselves have connections to Yiddish theater. Dan Apatashu, who has multi-generational connections to the Yiddish theater. He is the grandson of Yiddish novelist Yosef Apatashu and also the son of the actor David Apatashu, who himself, David Apatashu, also had his start in the Yiddish stage, though he is mostly known for his English language roles. So Dan grew up in this world of Yiddish artists, and here we hear a little glimpse into his relationship with Molly Picon.
Picon, I remember, used to chase me around her living room with me squealing in delight, singing the witches song from Kischefmacher. Kim, Kim, Kim my hair to mir den Stiefel. You know, like, ah! And I'd run under the piano. Picon.
And the last Yiddish theater personality we're going to look at here is Maurice Schwartz. And he lived from 1889 to 1960, also born in Ukraine, as some of the others we've heard about. He started acting early on. In 1911, he was hired by David Kessler for his company at the Second Avenue Theater, and he spent 6 years working there. In 1913, he gained his Hebrew Actors Union card, and in 1918, I believe, he founded the Yiddish Art Theater at the Irving Place Theater on Second Avenue in New York. And he wanted it to be a people's theater that could produce classic literary works. And he founded it in association with an acting school, believing that, you know, actors needed to develop their skills by taking on a wide range of roles. And fun fact, Paul Muni was one of his students. He's been called the greatest of all Yiddish actors, the Laurence Olivier of the Yiddish Stage. He also did perform in English, but he is most known within the Yiddish world. And here we see another familiar face, perhaps, to most of you, Leonard Nimoy, whom you may recognize from his role as Spock on Star Trek. And one thing you might not know about him is that he started out as a struggling young artist when he moved to California to pursue his dreams of acting. And he did several productions as a native Yiddish speaker in the Yiddish theater or with Yiddish theater personalities.
Next contacted me and called me because Maurice Schwartz was coming to town to do some theater here. And whoa, that was a name to reckon with in the Yiddish theater. The founder of the Yiddish Art Theater, Yiddish Kunsttheater in New York. I went to meet him. He was doing Schwartz an Yid in English, Hard to Be a Jew, a Shalom Aleichem comedy, and which he had done very successfully in New York. And the role that was open was a role that had originally been played by Muni Weisenfreund. Paul Muni had done the role with Schwartz in New York in the Yiddish theater. So I was excited. Theater was on Los Angeles Boulevard, and I went to see him by appointment. And I came into the theater on an afternoon, and there was something going on stage, and he was standing, I recognized him, he was standing in the aisle with his wife. She turned to Schwartz and she said, "I kicked those for the guy in Schwartz an Yid." They didn't know I spoke Yiddish. So I thought, oh, this is great. I think I'm going to get a job. So I got the job, and I had to bleach my hair because I was playing a blonde goy, a blonde Gentile, who makes a bet with his Jewish friend. The Jewish friend says, "It's tough being a Jew." And the guy says, "No, what's so tough about it?" So he said, "Well, you try it, you know." So I become the goy who's posing as a Jew to see what it feels like to be in a Jewish community. And we ran for 16 weeks, which was a long run in Los Angeles. I admired him greatly. He was a wonderful theater man. He could create magic. He was brave on stage. He was big. He was bold. He was theatrical. Everything about him was theatrical. He was one of those old theater actor managers who really knew how to deliver the goods, you know. And given an opportunity on stage, he would get hold of it and chew it, you know. So I learned bravura acting from him. He was a very smart man, very dedicated to the Yiddish. He wrote articles frequently for the Forbes and other Yiddish publications. He wrote a letter in Yiddish to my parents, who were very worried about me at the time because I wasn't exactly tearing up Hollywood. You know. he wrote to them and said that he wanted to be my theatrical father and that I was doing okay. I was a nice kid and I was responsible and everything would be all right. And they cherished that contact from him because they knew, of course, who he was and his reputation. At the same time, there was a sense of a kind of a tragic quality about what was happening with him because the Yiddish audience was diminishing. The audience that came to our theater every night was all gray-haired Yiddishists. And he would lament the fact that he would watch the cars pull up outside the theater, the young people sitting in the front seats and the parents in the back seats. The parents would get up and come into the theater and the young people would drive away. And they'd come back and pick up the parents after the show. They would not come to see him. He was destined to move from city to find his Yiddish audience that was still there and do some performances and make a living. But the glory days of the Yiddish theater were over.
Oh, there's actually one more of these Yiddish theater celebrities I want to touch on. Ida Kaminska, who lived from 1899 to 1980. She was a second-generation Yiddish actress, the daughter of Rachel Kaminska. And Ida Kaminska was a towering director of the Warsaw Yiddish Theater and particularly important in the post-World War II Yiddish theater in Poland. And here's a clip of a little feature that we made about her.
Sie gewesen eine Persönlichkeit, ein Mensch vom Theater, was hat gefühlt so, wie man fühlt ein Stückel leibend, hat sie gefühlt die Akteure, wenn man mit darf nehmen und wenn man mit darf halten im Theater. Und sie hat gesicht neue und junge Menschen. Und dann sind es gewesen junge Menschen, die haben gehört Jiddisch. Also es ist nicht gewesen ein größer Problem.
Sie ist gewesen nicht kein Größe, sie gewesen eine kleine Frau. Nicht kein Schönheit, aber eine wunderbare Persönlichkeit. Und das hat ihr gegeben, eine Sache, Chein. Es ist gewesen, ihr Mirel Efros ist gewesen bekannt auf der ganzen Welt. Noch der Mamen. Der erste ist gewesen Esther Ruchel Kaminska. Und der zweite ist gewesen Ida Kaminska in Mirel Efros.
Also sie hat sie nicht genommen, junge Menschen. Und sie ist gewesen alt, sie hat gehabt eine Sekunde, eine wunderbare. Sie hat gekannt alle Piessen von uns wenig. Sie ist gewesen etwas, was ist nicht da ein zweiter als er. Versteht sich. Sie gewesen der künstlerische Leiter und sie, und dank ihr ist geworden ein Theater in Warschau. Sie hat es so gekämpft.
When Ida Kaminska came in 1960, we played in Sydney. And we played here at a huge theater which holds 3,000 people or something like that, the Palais Theatre. And we went to Sydney with her company. It was given Ida Kaminska.
So now I want to talk about something different, which we've already heard about in some of the bios that I've been reading about people, which is going from Yiddish to mainstream, local, whatever the mainstream is, and then sometimes coming back. So here we're going to hear a couple of stories from two wonderful actors. The first, Leah Kenning, you may recognize if you've seen the TV series Stissel. And here she talks about the decisions and thinking that she and her husband had regards to theater after making Aliyah from Eastern Europe, where they had already been established in the Yiddish theater there.
Ich war mir aber ganz sehr eine kliege Mama. Meine Mama hat gesagt, so, heb dich tun, weil sie hat überhaupt nicht gewiss, was du kommt vor. Heb dich tun auf Jiddisch. Beim Mittag und zu haben in die Fritte, noch wird ihr kennen Team, was ihr wollt. Christi, ihr wird nicht glauben, so ist es gewesen. Wir sind gewesen, als auch Menschen meinen, der Mensch weiß nicht von deinem chronometrisch, wo das geht. Wir sind rein in Ulpan. Wir sind rein in der Habima. Wir haben ungeheuben auf Hybrid. Und noch 2-3 Jahre hat meine Mama gemacht die erste Vorstellung auf Yiddish. Haben sie gespielt auf Yiddish. Und dadurch haben wir gemacht auf Yiddish, was wir mal gewollt. Gefahren auf der ganzen Welt.
And next we'll hear an American parallel to that from the wonderful Eleanor Visa. Similar tensions between the mainstream and Yiddish.
And Yiddish, when I was first starting out, I went to see this agent when I was working with Mary at Town Hall. I said, you know, I'm in a show, and I'd like you to see it. And he said, I said, it's this Yiddish play at Town Hall that seats, you know, 1,400 people. I mean, it wasn't a slouchy piece of work. And he said, don't tell anybody you do Yiddish. I said, what do you mean? He said, no, they'll just typecast you, and don't tell anyone you do it. It will limit you. And I took his advice, and I spent many years as a closeted Yiddishist, as though I was turning tricks at night or something horrible. I worked in secret. So it was a funny, not really, but I ran the other direction, really, you know, and my audience was running to me, and I was running like, no, I don't do Yiddish, I do English, I want to do English, and Yiddish, my heart is in English, in Yiddish. You know, my ego is in English, but my heart is in Yiddish.
So as I get to this last slides here, I invite you all to put some questions in the Q&A. I will happily answer what I can. So I couldn't end a talk about Yiddish theater without at least a nod to what's happening now. There's a lot of exciting new Yiddish theater, and some of you likely saw the wonderful Yiddish production of Fiddler auf dem Dach, Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish. And it was quite a phenomenon. And there is a bit of a question about why. You know, many of us loved Fiddler in English and loved the Volksbühne as a Yiddish theater, but why was there such an appeal about seeing this play in Yiddish? And we'll hear from one of the actors in the original production, his thoughts to that question.
I think the performers as well as the audiences have felt like hearing these characters speaking Yiddish is a revelation, because we're hearing them speak in their own language instead of somebody's idea of what they would say translated into English. And it's not only the character's own language, it's the language that they were first written in the source material by Sholem Aleichem. So the rhythms seem to work so well in Yiddish that the play flows in a way, and the characters seem more authentic speaking in Yiddish than, not that they didn't seem authentic in English, but there's just something about having these conversations in Yiddish.
Okay, so I'm going to leave it there, and I want to end with just an invitation to explore more about Yiddish theater. I really appreciate you taking an hour out of your life to hear from me and watch these stories together. And if you are interested in learning more, I have a couple of suggestions. First of all, go to a Yiddish theater near you, see if there's something happening in your community. You can, as I mentioned at the beginning, watch more stories like this, actually thousands more stories like this at yiddishbookcenter.org, where you can find the full interviews and a lot of maps of where people are talking about and beautiful family photos. Or if you want to just watch more clips like this, you can head over to our YouTube channel where um, we have many thousands more clips like this. There are also, of course, some wonderful books on Yiddish theater history, and increasingly there are Yiddish plays being translated into English. And if you are so lucky to read Yiddish, of course, you can read them in Yiddish. So I'm going to stop my share here and take a look at your questions. Someone has a question about Yiddish theater and klezmer in Europe. And there certainly are Yiddish festivals, klezmer, Yiddish Jewish festivals all over Europe. Some of the ones that I know of are the Krakow Jewish Festival, the Yiddish Summer Weimar. There is an institute in a couple of Yiddish institutes in Paris that do programs. They change the city every year. There are Yiddish language programs in Warsaw and in Vilna. So there's a lot going on with Yiddish in the summer. Yes. And seeing some great recommendations, and someone asked whether our YouTube clips are subtitled. So for any of our interviews that are not in English, we do subtitle the clips. The English language clips, we haven't added subtitles to all of them. There's so many of them. But many of our English language interviews have been transcribed thanks to support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So if you're interested in that for an accessibility reason, you can actually, the best I would recommend is going to yiddishbookcenter.org and watching the full interviews there. For those that have the transcripts, you can follow along side by side. And I'm seeing people with connections to Yiddish theater, which is so great. And yes, there is a comment about the fact that there are bilingual productions going on. So I know that is increasingly one of the ways that people are bringing Yiddish theater into this current moment. For example, Kadima from Melbourne is now doing Yentl in London. And yes, there's certainly a lot of different options in terms of how to make Yiddish theater appealing and accessible to modern audiences. A lot of times, including if anyone I saw in the comments, someone just saw Yiddish Fiddler. A lot of times we'll have super titles. So that's a way to hear Yiddish and also be simultaneously successful. But it's exciting to see the different ways that people are committed to both the Yiddish and making it accessible to people. Someone asked me about how many Yiddish theaters there were in New York. Dozens. There were in all the boroughs several Yiddish theaters at one point. So I actually don't know the exact count, but I've heard personally through my research and through these oral histories about many of them. I think there is some kind of interactive map of Yiddish New York that might include some of those locations. I'm seeing a question here about the overlap between Russian and Yiddish theater. I'm not the ideal person to ask that, as I'm not a theater scholar myself, but I do know that the scholars of Yiddish theater do talk about this, the way that Yiddish theater really drew on some of the Stanislavski methods and other traditions within the Russian theater tradition. And yes, someone is reminding us that I didn't actually, well, there was, I think, one mention to this, but that there was plenty of Yiddish theater also in the summer resorts in upstate New York, and Yiddish camps, including Unser Camp, which was, as someone points out, in Highland Mills, New York. These summer resorts, summer camps, would often have a kid's side and a family side, and there would be entertainment, including Yiddish theater and people reciting Yiddish poetry and lectures and so forth. Someone is asking me to repeat and spell the website. So if for the Yiddish Book Center's website, it's yiddishbookcenter.org. So Yiddish spelled Yiddish, and then bookcenter.org. Okay, any other questions here? I'm seeing some wonderful comments, which I really appreciate, but I am not going to read all of those out. I think people can see them if they want. Someone asked why we didn't include clips of performances, and that's because those are not what we have in our collections at the Yiddish Book Center. What we have are the oral histories, so I really want to highlight that. There are some Yiddish theater performances and certainly Yiddish films available from various other institutions, so I would point you there to find out more. And there are a couple of Yiddish theater related books in the Yiddish Book Center's own store, so I would also point you over there. Okay, well, I think we will leave it there, and I appreciate again all of you taking the time to spend an hour with us at the Yiddish Book Center. I want to thank you, really a großen Dank alle. Thank you so much for joining me and joining the Yiddish Book Center this evening. I also want to give a special thanks to Oren Klopfer, who was producing from behind the digital backstage curtain tonight. And this evening's program is part of the Yiddish Book Center's ongoing series of virtual and live public programs. I would encourage you to check out our online events calendar to view many of our upcoming public programs. We do virtual and live programs in cities across the country and abroad. So you can check out the full listing again at yiddishbookcenter.org. And I will just end with the plug that we can't do this work without you. So if you enjoyed what you saw tonight and you want to support the Oral History Project or the virtual public programs or any of the amazing work that the Yiddish Book Center does, I have incredible colleagues, and it's an honor to do this work, and we hope to be able to do it for many years into the future. So it is thanks to our members whose support makes all of our ongoing work possible. So you can learn more about how you can join the Yiddish Book Center as a member and support our work at yiddishbookcenter.org/donate. So, bleibt mir alle gesund und stark. Thank you all. Be well and take good care.